Honored you're joining us. I am Lauren Service, 3CSN coordinator and English faculty at Santa Rosa Junior College. Whoops. So before you joined us, we invited you to contribute to our community norms and expectations document. As noted in the email we sent out, we all have our own preferences for being in community that are often based on the powerful community experiences we've had in our personal, educational, and professional lives. When we enter our work without being conscious of these preferences, we allow dominant ways of being to continue dominating. So if we could just take a minute to read over the norms. So we want to thank everyone who's contributed to the document. And as we engage today, let's work to make these norms and expectations manifest in our interactions. In Pedagogy of the Oppressed, Freire defines praxis as reflection and action upon the world in order to transform it. Praxis invites us into critical reflection, which includes knowledge building and consciousness raising, and critical action, which is the action we take in direct response to our critical reflection. In the Equity in Action Praxis sessions, we hear from educators who are weaving critical reflection and critical action for equity to transform their classroom and college communities. Many of the educators we'll learn from in this series took Equity 101, and in that course, we conduct an equity audit of our work in education. We hold up a mirror and a magnifying glass to identify our strengths and our areas of growth. In response to the audit, we engage in praxis projects that invite us to address an area of growth, infusing new knowledge and taking action to better address gaps in opportunity and outcomes for students. So today, we welcome Scott Sandler from Gavilan College, who's an English instructor, and he's going to share his project with us on finding our way to a more just assessment practice, co-creating rubrics. Thanks, Scott.
Thank you. Let me share my screen. Oops, hold on one second. All right, can everybody see my screen? Yeah, okay. So I just want to start off, you know, what Lauren said was I was part of her Equity 101 course, and this was last summer. Wow, already a year. And in that course, one of the things we were asked to do was to come up with a praxis project. We were asked to play with, I think the word that Lauren used was operationalize, put into action a project that kind of addressed issues of equity, multiculturalism, cultural and community-based pedagogy, some of the things that we were learning, and to put it into practice. And so I did. I had my first incarnation of the project beginning last summer, and I've been fine-tuning it. So that's why I'm here today, is I'm just here to share. One of the videos that we saw in that Equity 101 class was by Jeff Duncan Andrade. The title was All Together Now, Academic Rigor and Culturally Responsive Pedagogy. And I was so taken by this video that I kept watching it and rewatching it. And then I even paused it so that I could get the words exactly right. And so this is from the video. I'm just going to read you what's on the screen. It says, if you're going to do this work, and he was talking about cultural and community responsiveness pedagogy. He said, if you're going to do this work, if you're really, oops, sorry, hold on, let me go back. If you're really going to wrestle with this, you have to constantly revisit the question, for what? Public schools, for what? My classroom, for what? This curriculum for what? This assessment for what? And if the answer to that question is not about kids being connected to self-esteem, knowledge of self, self-love, their ancestors, then you are not community responsive and you are not academically rigorous. So that is what stayed with me. And I looked at that question, this assessment for what? And I started to think about my own assessments, my own use of rubrics, and I just started to realize that my rubric was pretty static. It was something that I had recycled. I had recycled over different classes. I used the same rubric that I used when I was teaching in Los Angeles, that I was teaching in Gilroy. So I wasn't really letting the community at all inform what my rubric was about. And to me, it lacked that academic rigor that Jeff Duncan Andrade was talking about. I needed to do a better job of paying attention to the specific students who were sitting in front of me. And so it made me go back, look at my rubric, and ask myself, where is love of self in my rubric? Where does self-knowledge live in this rubric? And so I was reviewing not only my own rubric, but then I started looking at rubrics of colleagues, going online, finding rubrics, finding, I think, around 30 or 40 different rubrics. And one of the things that I found kept coming up were certain words like mastery, proficiency, demonstrates competency, fluency, standard English. These were some of the things that I was finding in those rubrics. And so it made me question, might those words get in the way of strong writing? Might those words inhibit strong writing? So if mastery to me feels like a very high stakes word, and one that might even create a sense of paralysis in the writer, right? I've got to demonstrate mastery. Proficiency is a word that's always left me cold. Words like competency, what I started to do was looking up the antonyms of these words. So when I looked up, demonstrates competency, the antonym was not competent, incapable, unable. And is that really a word that shows, is that a message of self-esteem, self-love, knowledge of self? And so I think that one of the things I wanted to start doing is thinking about the words that I was using, but not just thinking about what words resonated with me, but what words resonated with the students. And more importantly than that, what values resonated with the students. Another document we looked at in that Equity 101 course was something by Mickey Scott Bay Jones called An Invitation to a Brave Space. And in that document, it was kind of a classroom agreement. In that classroom agreement, she says, every student has the right to start somewhere and continue to grow. So that was another question that I had. Is growth, progress reflected in our rubrics? So this is what kind of got me, this is why I settled on this project, having to do with co-creating rubrics with the students. So before I keep going, I just want to pause because, like Lauren said, in a little while, we're going to go into breakout rooms and we're going to have discussions. So I wanted to kind of give you these things to think about while I'm going through my presentation. One is, what benefits do you see in co-creating rubrics with your students? Why might you want to do something like this? What challenges do you foresee in co-creating assessment rubrics with your students? Why might you be hesitant to do something like this? And then the third thing is, I want you to reflect upon a time when you were being assessed. When you were being assessed with a rubric that you had no voice or hand in creating. It's listening with empathy and understanding, putting yourself in the position of the students, but you yourself were assessed using a rubric at one point. You might also think about, are you part of a tenure review committee? Have you done peer observations? And have you had to rely on rubrics? And did you have some problems with those rubrics? And what was that like? And do you think that your voice should have been considered in the formation of a rubric, if you were going to use a rubric? So those are a few questions that I want you just to consider as we go forward. So I'm going to kind of go into some of the whys, and some I've already touched upon, but to shift from an external compliance tool to a motivational tool. And Lauren mentioned Paulo Freire at the very beginning, and he talks about this banking model of education where teachers deposit information and students kind of receive that information. And he warns about, instead of communicating with students, just lobbing in communiques, right? Using communiques in lieu of communication. And so sometimes, like, we might give a rubric to a student, but is there that kind of communication or dialogue, or is it just a communique? And if so, that starts to feel like more of something that a tool for compliance. Certainly, we want to think about a rubric in terms of increasing student agency, ownership, investment through a process of inquiry. And I think one of the things that I really want us to take from this is the need to nurture a culture of inquiry and an interrogation in our classrooms, and how important that is. To create a tool for reflection. So hopefully, if you're using a rubric, you're not just using it in terms of something, a summative assessment, but a formative assessment, something that we can go back to and look at throughout the semester. And to identify what we value in writing, learning within a community of learners. I know, more whys, but it's important. And I won't read every single one of these, but the need to validate and integrate student voices in our assessment tools. The need to create a shared vocabulary. So one really cool thing that happened in doing this is the students and I would talk with each other using the language of the rubric. So they said, we could say, there's some empty drum writing in here. An empty drum is something that makes a lot of noise but isn't really saying much, right? So we all knew what that term was. Another thing they said is, I want to be able to taste the rainbow in the writing. And so I would say, I don't taste the rainbow in the writing. But we knew what we were talking about. So really, the students became so much more involved in not only the creation of the rubric, but in underscoring the values, or being aware of the values that were in the rubric, because they helped to create it. And then, of course, we can talk about bias, unconscious bias, and the need to minimize those biases. And that would happen if you create something in community, as opposed to me creating it by myself with my own limitations and just through my lens. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about James Baldwin, because he really is someone who I think, when we talk about creating that culture of interrogation and inquiry, he's a champion of that. And so this is from his work called The Creative Process. Baldwin says that sometimes answers are given to us in order to stop us from asking more questions, right? He says it's the artist's job to expose the questions in the answers. So I might give you a rubric, but that shouldn't be the end of it, right? We need to create a healthy spirit of interrogation and inquiry And students should be able to ask, why am I being assessed this way? And are there other more significant ways or meaningful ways that you could assess me? Or is this how you assess your students in every class? What I want, and by the way, this is something that not only the students should be asking, but we all should be asking on a community campus, right? So if I'm on a tenure review committee using a rubric, I should be able to stop and say, why is this question important in helping to evaluate my peer? Is there a more meaningful way that I could approach this? So when we're talking about rubrics, again, I want us to realize that we're talking about, or when we're talking about assessment, we're talking about for everybody on a campus community. But what I love about James Baldwin is, if we are artists of asking questions, we're going to be able to better advocate for ourselves, for our families, for our communities, for our programs. And so that's something that I wanted to bring in. I think it's really important. And Herbert Marcuse brings up some of the same issues. And he uses the analogy of map makers and city planners. And he says, map makers and city planners, they establish routes to help drivers navigate, to help them navigate the countryside. He writes in his essay, and I'm going to read for 1 second. He writes, "The countryside is shaped and organized by the highway." So how we experience the countryside is shaped by something that's already been pre-established for us, something that's been predetermined for us. We are being guided, and we're being told, here's what's worth seeing, here are the great places where you should stop, here's what's most safe for you, here's what's most convenient for you. And he says that to deviate in any way might make you seem irrational. So let's say I'm looking at what the map makers gave me, let's say I'm looking at what the city planners gave me, and he says, why would you question that? To do so makes you seem irrational. So again, if we want to kind of motivate people, we need to be able to question these things without making anybody feel irrational or like a crank for doing so. And so, this is the rubric paradox. I give my rubric to my students and I feel like I'm being transparent. Look, you can see how I'm going to evaluate you. I'm very clear about it. You can see how I'm weighing each part of the assessment. I'm being very clear about it. I'm being upfront with you. I'm trying to make your life easier, right? Like the map maker, like the city planner. I'm trying to do these things for you. Why would you question it? And there could be a paternalistic feeling about it, like I know what's best for you, right? Don't challenge us. And sometimes the more, like, if I give you the rubric, it might actually stop you from asking questions about how you're being assessed. And while the rubric might be upfront, the process of designing that rubric, or the principles undergirding that rubric, might not be transparent. Those might be invisible, not only to the students, but even to the teacher, or even to the staff member, whoever created that. So we need to really kind of take a step back and question those values that helped inform that rubric. And by doing it in community, we're trying to integrate the value of the collective rather than just one person's values. So last Friday, I got to watch a Zoom concert. I don't know if any of you have been during this time of quarantine. All these musicians are doing these concerts right now. So I got to watch Lyle Lovett and John Hyatt. I love both of those guys. And they would do a song, then they would banter, then they would do a song, then they would banter. So in one of those moments, John Hyatt played a song, and Lyle Lovett said to him, I understand that you composed that song using the piano, and does the instrument that you use impact the way that you compose your music? And John Hyatt said, yeah, I'm not that great on the piano, but I feel like the limitations can be good things. And Lyle Lovett said, yeah, I rely heavily on them. So that's stuck with me, the need to rely heavily on our limitations. I think our country would be better off if we relied heavily on our limitations, because if we're aware of our limitations, if we're able to identify our limitations, then we're more likely to have some humility, reach out in community with others, and we're more likely to embrace the collective. So this is another why, is that we need to design within community, and we need to realize that we have limitations, rely heavily on them, and to work in an interconnected way. And this is also an opportunity to talk with our students about issues of blind spots, unconscious bias, meritocracy. And meritocracy, that's when we see merit in someone who writes like us, or we see merit in someone who thinks like us. That could be human nature, but we need to be aware of it. And so think about when we leave these things undiscussed or unquestioned, that could lead to disparity, inequity. And so it's really important to do this work in community. So I just want to talk a little bit about how to do this. And I'm not considering myself an expert. I'm a wayfinder, and I consider you co-wayfinders as we talk about how to do this work. But one is, first of all, you don't just say, okay, create a rubric. There's scaffolding that goes into it. So that scaffolding could be where you're bringing in other rubrics and you're having students familiarize themselves with the different parts of the rubric, reflect on what they like or don't like, maybe take an a reading apprenticeship approach to our rubrics. We could also take pieces of writing, and the teacher could bring it in, or you can ask the students to bring in a piece of writing that they love. And we can just have discussions. What do we see in this writing? What do we value about this writing? How would we judge this if this were in this class? How does this relate to the kind of writing that you might typically expect in a class like ours? So we can think about different ways of scaffolding, but those are a couple approaches. Oops, my light just went off. Can you guys still see me? Okay. So I used a book, which I still have not returned to the library, called Introduction to Rubrics, and it's by Danelle Stevens and Antonia Levy. And so they had a lot of different models of how you could do some co-creating of rubrics. And so I'm going to just share the one that I did with my students, but I've also put in the PowerPoint some other models as well. What? So what I did was I used the easel pads, large easel pads, and a lot of Post-its. And so I would ask students, I'd give them the assignment and ask them to write down one idea which would show that you did some excellent fulfillment of this assignment. One idea per Post-it. So they would do that. It was a brainstorming session where they would do one idea per Post-it. Then they would get into groups and they would create clusters of Post-its based on their similarities. And then they would label those categories, and then they would share those out with the class. So then after they would share those out with the class, we would listen, and we ended up voting on what we thought were some of the most important dimensions for our rubric. And we also talked about the dangers of having too many dimensions in our rubric. You know, when I was looking through my past rubrics, one of them had 10 dimensions to it. And if there are too many dimensions, it becomes hard for the student to focus. If you want to really shine a light on certain things, you want to maybe limit it to 4 to 5 dimensions, maybe. So it did take time. That's why there are other models. There's a pass the hat model, where students do some brainstorming on a sheet of paper, pass it into the instructor, and the instructor at home will look at those slips of papers and do the organizing, the kind of work that you would do in the classroom. There's a pass the hat model. There's a 4x4 model, where each student comes up with 4 possible dimensions that they want to focus on. And let's see, they would identify 4 possible dimensions. Each group would write down 4. They would get into groups of 4. They would, and then think about what generated the most discussion, what were they most passionate about, and then we would vote for 4. So there are a lot of different ways that you can do this. There's no one way of co-creating your rubrics. So then they would come up with their rubric. So this was part of their brainstorming in my class. So rather than ABC, they came up with lo hiciste, casi, and que pasa. That's how they labeled it. And so they would say, lo hiciste, you kept the reader's attention. Lo hiciste, you shared some personal experience. The reader can gain advice or learn something from the text. Casi, you got sidetracked. You attempted to get the reader's attention. So what would happen is the students would do some brainstorming, and then it was the job of the peers and of me then to pose questions to the students. So again, it's about communications, not communiques, right? And so, you know, these were some questions. I love your point about keeping the reader's attention. While it may not be hard to get the reader's attention, it is another thing to be able to keep it. Great. When you say attempts to get the reader's attention, you are making the point that they are trying. Good. What does it look like to try but fall short? So hopefully you would ask some questions that would guide them to do more thinking, right? I'll just share with you for a moment a look at the actual rubric, and then I'll come back to the PowerPoint. So in here, they said you can feel the rainbow in the writing. So my question was, well, what does that mean? What does that mean to feel the rainbow in the writing? So then they changed it to, you can feel the rainbow in the writing, by which we mean, and then they could unpack that, right? It's easy to picture, the language is alive, there are moments of surprise, right? So you would ask them questions, and that would lead to a more developed, detailed rubric. Really important is that when you do come up with the rubric, you don't want to rewrite their words to make it sound like your voice, right? Which could be a natural instinct. Well, I think the students really mean this, or I think it would be more clear if you said it this way, and you might change the phrasing of the students in such a way that they don't recognize it as their own. So I would really say that you don't want students to invest their time and effort into helping to get their voices in a rubric, and then they don't see themselves reflected in that final product. You got to be very careful about that. And then, of course, after every couple essays, you're going to have to go back and look at what's working well about the rubric, what's not working well about the rubric. So what we did was we did 2 essays using 1 rubric. Then we went back and we said, so first we did an appreciative inquiry, like what's working really well, what can we build upon, but then also where do we need to channel our efforts in revising this rubric. So, you know, they're involved in helping to reflect on how well the rubric's working. Okay. And so I just want to end with this, what I think are the values of doing this work. It's about learning in community. It's about honoring the collective. It's about creating a culture of interrogation and inquiry, James Baldwin style. It's about an invitation into a brave space and making sure that that rubric invites people into that space. It's about creating a tool for self-reflection, self-knowledge, and it's about a tool for self-advocacy, self-love. And I think with that, I think we might be ready to go into the breakout rooms.
Indeed.
So we will stop recording right now.